Good evening. Good evening. I'm Sarah Estelle. I'm a professor of economics here at Hope and also the director of Markets and Morality. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the members of Markets and Morality seated here to my left, but also our wonderful co-sponsors, the Tocqueville Forum. And it's pretty exciting for us to gather with this large of a group once again. It's been just too long. But we're even more excited to bring Dr. Brianne Wolf here to speak with you tonight. So I don't want to speak too long, but I do want to mention two logistical details. Markets morality is nothing if not big promoters of the life of the mind, right? Asking big questions and free expression, right? And we want you to be part of the marketplace of ideas. So one thing I want to invite you to do, if you're interested in learning more about anything I've just said, or what Markets and Morality is, what we do, what we have coming up this semester, please join us at the back of the auditorium just for a couple minutes after the Q&A time, and some of our members will be happy to talk with you. We're also being joined by an audience via live stream, so I welcome them in particular, and invite you, since you're not here, if you would like to learn more, to email us at marketsandmorality@hope.edu. That's markets, spell out the word and morality, no spaces, at hope.edu. But you can engage even tonight. So the second logistical detail that you need to know is the way to ask questions this evening. Because we do have a hybrid audience, we want to use some of the lessons we learned during COVID and use a website, slido.com. If you have your smartphone or a laptop, all you have to do is type in slido.com. And when you get there, our code is self-interest. No space, just the two words, self-interest. Not promoting it, just tying into the title of the lecture, although we could do another lecture on how it's a God-given aspect of human nature. But that's beside the point. So please do ask questions, even now, even as we begin with the lecture. And if you'd share your name with us, and your affiliation, if you tell us you're a student, we'll definitely prioritize your question. If you're joining us from afar and you want to offer your affiliation, it'd be lovely to know who is joining us, and we'll make sure the questions get to Dr. Wolf after her lecture. So slido.com, self-interest. So to introduce our speaker, I want to invite Dr. Paulette from the Political Science Department and director of the Tocqueville Forum up here.
What do the S and the D stand for, by the way? Supply and demand. What's that? Supply and demand. Could have given me a month of Sundays, I wouldn't have come up with that. Wow, yeah. Welcome, everyone. It's good to have public events like this again and a nice turnout. Good to see you all. Professor Paulette, Political Science, Garrett. I run the Tocqueville Forum. I don't know if you got an email today about the Tocqueville Forum. We're a more informal group named after Alexis de Tocqueville to study, as Tocqueville would say, human liberty, property understood. We're mainly a reading group, free food involved. We sit and discuss a book. We've got a nice book set up for this year. Every other week we get together to discuss it. We have a weekend retreat that we do. That's a lot of fun, and other activities from time to time, lectures and so forth. So if you're interested in joining or learning more about it, email me or come visit me and we can discuss. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Brianne Wolf is Assistant Professor of Political Theory, which I think we can all agree is the single most important field of study that there is, at the James Madison College at Michigan State University. Having graduated from the James Madison College herself, she made her way, stopping for a master's degree at the University of Chicago, to Madison, Wisconsin, where she received her PhD. I expect that her forthcoming child will be named Madison. If you have to pick a name, that's the one I would go with. I worked on that joke for a while, by the way, and apparently she's the only one who was amused by it. I'm sad to say. I was like, how do I phrase this exactly? I would have expected her forthcoming book to be on Madison. But in fact, it's not. It's on the role of taste in the thought of Rousseau Adam Smith and David Hume. Good taste might well explain why she married a Badger while she was living in Wisconsin and not a Spartan, but it certainly explains the important academic work that she's doing. In addition to her aforementioned book and work on those thinkers, Smith, Hume, and Rousseau, she has also published works concerning the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville and Friedrich Hayek, the former pleasing one sponsor of tonight's lecture, the Tocqueville Forum, and the latter decidedly pleasing the other sponsor, Markets and Morality. We at Hope College are very pleased that she has agreed to share her knowledge with us tonight, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Wolf to the microphone.
Hello all, thank you so much for having me here. My talk today is titled, Can Your Interests Combat Self-Interest? And so I'm going to focus on Adam Smith, on good taste, moral judgment, and interpersonal connection. You'll learn what those things are, hopefully, while I'm talking to you about them. And as Professor Pollette said, it's based on my book manuscript, which is still in progress, that is responding to a debate in political theory and really contemporary society as a whole about ways that we can sustain liberal society. So I try to give an account of taste in response to this debate. And so to make this argument, I actually need to begin with what liberalism is and its critics more generally. So today, many in society argue that divides over questions of morality have stalled the political process. Others suggest that lack of agreement on moral norms has all but eliminated civic discourse, and even in some cases, economic transactions because of cancel culture. It was never considered proper to debate religion or politics in polite company, but increasingly it's seen as improper to debate them on social media, on college campuses like this one, or even with close friends. And further, there are those who question whether average individuals can even judge contested moral issues for themselves. American political scientists argue that Americans are divided because they're just following the opinions of elites, and they're divided. They have little faith in ordinary people to make informed decisions in their own interests. So what has become clear is that people do not trust one another to make good moral decisions. Citizens don't trust one another either to have a conversation about politics or morality. Now, liberalism was a doctrine advanced out of a desire to limit conflicts over the summum bonum in societies, namely religion. Political rights and economic laws of trade were established to allow societies to sidestep the problem of deciding on one definition of morality and the good, letting individuals exercise their own judgment, while still allowing people to coordinate and cooperate with one another. And if liberalism was against defining the social good, it was for defining a social bad, intolerance. I define the liberal tradition to be that which, as philosopher Jeremy Waldron has said, is characterized by themes such as religious toleration, the neutrality of the state, the distinction between ethics and politics, and the dangers of moral complacency and communitarian conformism. And so really I take liberalism at its base to be concerned with the realization of human freedom in society. So one of the central tenets of liberalism is a commitment to plurality. But the management of pluralism is not a sufficient defense of liberalism for liberal critics. Liberal critics have worried that the emphasis on individual judgment and self-interest is actually undermining the social ties that make for strong communities and a healthy society. So the task for liberalism is to defend not only its ability to manage diverse opinions, but to actually be able to build bonds despite facilitating an environment where plurality flourishes. So critics of liberalism have argued that conflicts over politics that we experience today are actually just one symptom that demonstrate that liberalism is failing or has failed. They've been making an argument like this for decades. So critics of liberalism actually fall into two broad camps. So on the right, conservatives argue that liberalism has broken down traditions, customs, and the family. So Patrick Deneen argues, for example, that liberalism claims to value all values, but prioritize no vision of the good. But in reality, its vision of the good is, he says, self-making individualism. And this ideal undermines many of the social structures that actually make for full, robust human lives in Deneen's view, such as local practices and traditions, the family, the community, religion, notions of citizenship, and national affection. And the result, he says, quote, modern liberalism proceeds by making us more individualist and more statist, end quote. Another scholar, Adrian Vermeule, maintains that liberalism institutes a new political theology that doesn't satisfy human needs at all in the way that actual religion or the state traditionally has. He claims that liberalism, quote, constantly disrupts deeply cherished traditions among its subject populations, stirring unrest, animosity, and eventually political reaction and backlash, end quote. Populism and populists argue against elite control of many liberal institutions, such as government administration and the global marketplace. Populists reject liberal pluralism in favor of a united people that is represented and can act in favor of the majority rather than just protecting a variety of minority rights. And one other scholar on the right, Alistair McIntyre, claims that liberalism is corrosive because it champions the individual at the expense of the community. For McIntyre, communities help direct individuals towards the highest good in life, and liberalism separates individuals from this pursuit and relationships with others in favor of autonomy. Now, critics on the left focus on the problematic nature of the market, inequalities generated under liberal regimes, and norms, and finally, the way that liberalism undermines community. And these critics often refer to liberalism as neoliberalism. So one scholar, Nancy Fraser, presents a feminist critique of neoliberal capitalism. She argues that the state further entrenches capitalist power rather than advancing redistributive justice or democratic political accountability. Michael Sandel argues that market values under liberalism have overtaken our society, and they've crowded out all kinds of other values, such as familial love, duties of citizenship, and love of learning for his own sake. He thinks we ought not to pay people for good grades. He also argues that liberalism encourages an autonomous self divorced from important social ties. Cornel West argues that power structures in liberal society further the plight of the vulnerable in society and excuse the elite from taking social responsibility and fulfilling the promises of liberalism to protect human rights. Finally, Michael Walser argues that liberalism needs to include considerations of associations, marginality, hierarchies of power, and social conflict to better respond to inequalities in society. Now, critics on the left and the right actually have a few commonalities in their complaints about the liberal order. One is that the market generates selfishness, and the other is that liberalism undermines emotional ties necessary for a community. So liberalism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When I say liberalism, though, I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. As I stated, I'm talking about the political ideologies concerning the conditions necessary for the exercise of freedom. And different people think differently about these conditions and what are the most important principles to defend the exercise of freedom in response to many of these critics I've just discussed. So defenses of liberalism are often mounted from two general bases. We get economic liberalism or political liberalism. So some think that economic liberalism is the best way to defend liberty. They argue for the principles necessary to ensure economic freedom, such as free markets, limited government, and property rights. And some thinkers who defend liberalism on these grounds include John Locke, Friedrich Hayek, and Ludwig von Mises. Others argue that political liberalism is the best way to defend freedom. And these folks are concerned with protecting individual rights, and not just property rights, but rule of law and equality so individuals can plan their lives. And thinkers who defend liberalism on these grounds include John Stuart Mill, Judith Shklar, John Rawls, and Jeremy Waldron. So these primary defenses of liberalism and critiques about too much focus on self-interest or autonomy bring me to the question of this talk and my book more generally. Is there a vision of liberal political economy that can aid both the conditions of economic and political liberalism? And can this vision of liberalism answer the challenges from critics about self-interest and individualism? In other words, as the title of my talk suggests, is there something that can combat self-interest? So my argument. My book turns to thinkers of the 18th century, and I include Tocqueville actually too at the beginning of the 19th, for a model of how to navigate political, ethical, and economic disagreements through taste. And the 18th century offers actually really rich examples to explore because society was navigating conflicts over plurality, much like we are today, especially religion. The 18th century was also one of increased interaction among people of different cultures, races, and nationalities because of the age of exploration and colonization, the Industrial Revolution, and the political revolutions in America and France. So crucial, actually, was the quest to open markets abroad and exploit their resources that in 1714, the British government offered a prize of £20,000, which is equivalent to over £2.5 million in today's money, for someone to solve the problem of longitude so ships could better navigate at sea. So I argue that 18th century liberalism has an argument to explain how economic and political liberalism fit together. Liberalism promotes human freedom, but also developed with ways to hold individuals responsible to one another. Liberalism developed with the notion of political protection of rights joined to the economic pursuit of wealth. And we can see this in what I call the affective dimension of liberalism. So to bridge the gap between its political and economic dimensions, liberalism has and needs a third component, the affective, affect, emotion, right? So focusing on affect instead of just rights or price reveals a different way to defend liberal political economy. And it's on this perspective that I'm focusing in my talk today. And just to clarify, I'm not suggesting that this affective dimension can replace either the political or economic dimensions of liberalism, but rather that the affective dimension is important to the success of both the economic and political dimensions. And one could certainly respond to the critics I have mentioned by focusing either on economic principles or political principles, but my work suggests that what we are missing, and part of what liberalism needs, is the affective dimension. So liberalism has and needs taste as a supplement to market relations and the legal framework of rights to stimulate moral judgment, develop individual judgment for free citizens, foster emotional ties between citizens to help them work together in civil society, and to limit excessive individualism. So in the remainder of my talk, I will first explain what taste is and how it can help us think through potential solutions to liberalism's issues. I will especially focus on how taste was understood in the 18th century. Next, I'm going to discuss some of the ways one 18th century thinker thought taste could remedy a specific ill. I'm going to focus on Adam Smith and relating to distant others. And finally, I will discuss how taste could help us navigate distance and disagreement in liberalism today. So to understand the role the affective will play in liberal political economy, I need to define taste. And I define this as an effective judgment of the beautiful, formed through individual education and experiences, but also intersubjective discussion between people. And so taste is the judgment of the beautiful that we form through our sensory experience and also talking about that with other people. I'm using the idea of taste rather than the more formal term aesthetic judgment because this is the language that thinkers in the 18th century used to demonstrate the connection between taste and the embodied experience. So in the French context, goût is the word used for aesthetic judgment, but also your physical sense of taste when you're eating something. In the history of political thought, art and politics were often separated. In antiquity, Plato famously bans the poets from the ideal city in the Republic. The passions were seen as dangerous, something to be controlled by reason. And the classical thinkers were concerned with beauty. However, they did care about that, and they thought of the highest beauty in mathematical proportions. And today we think of aesthetics as the philosophical study of art, but in the 18th century, this form of study wasn't so clearly separated from other social, political, and even economic concerns. So some of the key debates in the 18th century were about whether judgments of taste could be made disinterestedly, what was the role of reason or emotion in forming these judgments? Can we even have a universal standard of taste? Is there a connection between morality and our aesthetic judgments? Is this a faculty that everyone can exercise, or is it only for the elite? And what's the relationship between wealth, status, and aesthetic judgment? What kinds of objects can we say are in good taste? What's the difference between beauty experienced through pleasure and the sublime, a transcendent experience? And many of the important figures in the discussion around taste were part of the Scottish Enlightenment and the Edinburgh Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Sciences, Manufactures, and Agriculture in Scotland. And Adam Smith, the subject of my talk, was part of this. You can find his name somewhere on the list of register there, and his good friend David Hume were members. And they actually awarded a prize for the best essay on taste to Alexander Gerard, another thinker, in 1759. They also awarded prizes for things like the best linen cloth under 28 yards, and my favorites, the best hogshead of strong ale and porter. Those are my preferred ones there. And so for the thinkers in my project, aesthetic judgment has a few key characteristics. So first, taste relies on our emotional experience rather than just reason. It relies on our actual experience with the world, not just our ideas about the world. And emotion is also key because the emotional recognition of beauty is what is able to pull us outside ourselves, outside our own interests. And you can think about a time when you've been consumed by a show, or how a movie was filmed, or the performance of an actor, or the details and intricacies of a storyline, or the same thing for a song, a piece of clothing, a work of art, etc. For a minute at least, you're transported beyond yourself and your immediate cares and taken somewhere else by the creation or the piece of art. Second, taste parallels the process of moral judgment for my thinkers. So you can think, for example, about judging the character of another person. So they argue that taste helps us hone the skills of judging better and worse, beautiful and ugly. It hones our individual judgment, and therefore serves as a primer for our social relationships. Taste also engages individual judgment in relation to the judgment of others. So for each of my thinkers, taste is insignificant if it's just individual, if it's just what you think by yourself. This is what separates it from just preferences that we like to talk about in economics. So in this sense, each thinker I study would refute the colloquialism, there's no accounting for taste, which implies that taste is so individual as to be completely meaningless. And I show that taste cannot be simply individual, or it doesn't count. You've not actually made a judgment. It hasn't had to be defended or proven to anyone. And in fact, in his entry for the Enlightenment project, the Encyclopédie, Voltaire argues against this view, saying, quote, "Arts have genuine beauty. There exists a good taste that discerns it and a bad taste that is unaware of it, and often the flaw of the mind that produces wrong taste can be corrected," end quote. In other words, we can decide on taste. Taste also fosters bonds between individuals. This happens through the shared experience of the beautiful. Think, for example, about watching a sunset over Lake Michigan with someone, or engaging in a discussion about a great book or a movie you've seen recently. This shared emotional experience can provide a basis for further relationship. And in fact, some thinkers in my book go so far as to say the moment of transcendence experienced in judging beauty can provide the bond that pulls people outside of their self-interestedness, and we'll come back to that. So this is an outline of the book as a whole and some of the things I'm trying to cover. My research seeks to understand taste as a component of the affective dimension of liberalism, as I've said, and so I try to do this by examining thinkers who argued for liberal principles, but also each thinker in my project has a particular problem they're worried about in the emerging liberal order. And I show how they thought taste could respond to this particular problem. So a couple of examples of that. So in the chapter on Hume, Hume thinks that taste can help solve the problem of faction, actually, by demonstrating productive ways of debating different moral views. In my chapter on Rousseau, he's critiquing modern society, and he's particularly worried about the rich controlling society. And he wants to show how if we develop individual judgment, we can prevent that sort of elite capture of democratic institutions. I'm going to focus on my chapter on Smith today, and how Smith thinks taste can help supplement sympathy in helping individuals avoid excessive self-interest and promoting a free economy. In the chapter on Tocqueville, I look at his analysis of democratic taste and how it can prevent individualism, egoism, and majority tyranny by helping people participate together in civic life. And so this argument for the affective dimension of political economy of liberalism is actually not a new argument. Scholars have argued that markets can foster morality. You know that. You've got the sign right here, right? So for example, if I want to trade with you, I have to treat you as an equal to get what I want from trade. Though I might be motivated by self-interest when I participate in the market can cause me to treat you better than I would have otherwise to satisfy my self-interest. The morality that comes from the market's not a robust and thorough exercise of virtue, but self-interest motivates virtue where it might otherwise not be in the market order. Other scholars argue that constitutional rule of law, a culture of personal freedom and individual rights can foster emotional bonds between citizens. For example, the recognition of your humanity and equality under the law can inspire me to pursue justice on your behalf. But in both of these cases, markets and rights are relying on sympathy, on what Smith will call fellow feeling alone to achieve this effect. My argument is speaking to this scholarship, but I want to build on it because there can be some challenges with relying on sympathy or fellow feeling, and I want to look for other ways that we can build ties between people. Now I want to turn to Smith's political economy in particular to understand how he thought taste could help contribute to freedom in society. So sympathy for Smith is fellow feeling with others, something like we today call empathy. Imagining oneself in the position of another, putting yourself in another person's shoes. And he says, we imagine the situation of others and we attempt to feel with them. We can't help it. This is the basis for all social relations in his moral philosophy. The next step for sympathy then is to judge propriety, or we judge whether the behavior of others fits with what we expect it to be or think it should be. We bring the emotions of another home to ourselves, Smith says, and then we determine whether or not they are appropriate. And this process is the basis for making moral judgments. So he gives this example. You're in a group and somebody tells a joke, and one person in the group seems to laugh 30 seconds longer than everybody else and a little bit louder. And that's when everyone sort of looks at them and they're like, well, the joke was funny, but not that funny. Kind of like Professor Bullitt's joke about how I should name my baby Madison, right? We deem their reaction inappropriate in that situation, right? We bring it home to ourselves and say, no, not that funny. And finally, we judge our own behavior in accordance with whether or not others sympathize with us. We develop a kind of conscience, or what Smith will call the impartial spectator. This is an imaginative construct that acts as an objective observer, viewing our behavior, knows all the context and facts, and then determines what appropriate behavior in a given context would entail. So ideally, we moderate our behavior based on what real spectators, those around us, think about our behavior and how they react, as well as to how this internal guide, our conscience, the impartial spectator, views our behavior. And so through all of the many interactions we have in society, we begin to understand how others view us and how we ought to change our behavior. Sounds good, right? But sympathy for Smith is famously limited. So though sympathy can provide lots and lots of benefits for our social life and for political economy, can't do everything. It's limited by physical and cultural space, our familiarity with other people, our emotional connections to people, and even our social status. And scholars have called this limitation Smith's circles of sympathy. And this is how this works. So the person we know the best and can sympathize with most is ourselves. We totally understand why we're behaving the way we are and why we think what we do, right? And then the next layer of the circle is our acquaintances, our coworkers, people from our nation. We understand them because we're around them and experience the same things as them and can enter into why they do things. You can think, for example, about international events, back when we could travel, or we just had the Olympics this summer, or seeing someone from your nation if you've traveled abroad. There's a sort of fellow feeling, like we're from the same place, we experience the same things, right? And then the outermost circle is everybody else in the world. strangers, people we don't know so well. It's kind of hard to put ourselves in their shoes because we don't know a lot about them. The less familiar we are with people, the harder it is to sympathize with them because we can't imagine their situation. Their context is hard to understand. Their experiences are not familiar to us. So, for example, it's much easier to sympathize with a family member or a friend when someone they love has died than to sympathize with victims of a natural disaster somewhere really far away in the world. Or even in our own nation, it's sort of hard for us here in Michigan to sympathize with victims of Hurricane Ida, for example. We don't have hurricanes in Michigan, right? We don't know what that's like. And this makes sense. It's hard to put ourselves in another's shoes when we aren't familiar with their situation. And for Smith, the limited nature of sympathy is perfectly natural. But it's still concerning. And for him, it's difficult to accept. And for us, it's even more difficult to accept in an age where we have to, much more than Smith's time, interact with others who are geographically distant from us. Zoom has really brought that home to us, right? Or we have to interact with those within our own society who seem culturally or materially distant. And even in Smith's time, as trade was becoming global, he was disturbed by the limits of sympathy because of its important role as the basis for moral life. So Smith tries to think about some ways in which we could solve this problem. One is the market, right? We've talked about the market engages our self-interest in the well-being of others. We have to work with them to get what we want, and so it interests us in the situation of people that we wouldn't otherwise have a reason to interact with. We could institute general rules of morality, Smith says, kind of like rule of law. These rules limit our tendency to overvalue ourselves and act in our interest against others. We also have the law of justice, right? There's a standard of justice in every society. For Smith, this should be negative, meaning that we are free to act as long as we don't harm others. And for Smith, justice can and should be enforced by the law, but it also can act as a sort of innate force within us that will check our self-deceit. But one avenue that Smith actually discusses but hasn't been much explored as a solution to this problem of sympathetic distance is taste. So then the question is, can aesthetic appreciation, or our interests, as I put in my title, bridge the sympathetic gap in Smith's account? And if so, what are the effects on his political economy? And if not, what are the consequences? So taste for Smith is admiration and recognition of beauty. And this occurs especially when we think that something fits well or is precisely suited to its object. Our emotions are engaged and we experience aesthetic pleasure at anything that approximates order, whether that's the order of nature or man-made skill. So think about if you guys looked at those BuzzFeed articles where someone's able to cut something perfectly and everything's in perfect order, and they have all these slides of how these images are in perfect lines or aesthetically pleasing. That's what Smith is getting at, right? And he gives some examples of his own. We can think a picture, a poem, a philosophical system, or something in nature like a mountain or a plain fits this definition of taste. We get immense pleasure from order because our mind is tranquil. It is for Smith why we pursue science and philosophy. We want to make the world ordered. We don't want to deal with chaos, right? It's also why we might pursue political economy. So there's lots of things that, and features of taste, things that it does and features of taste in Smith's theory. So first, taste can draw individuals outside of themselves. He notes that the emotions taste inspires serve as a source of connection between people. Taste can provide what he says, quote, a correspondence of sentiments between spectators because they're sharing in a discussion of an object. And it's different from sympathy because the thing that you're discussing is not tied to our personal experiences or our moral character. So think about looking at Lake Michigan with someone else or discussing the latest Netflix original that you both saw. Individuals engaging in intellectual exchanges can find a kind of connection with one another that does not require actually putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Second, taste can overcome issues of disagreement. Smith gives an example comparing taste and sympathy on this score. He notes that if you were to tell someone that a family member passed away, or that you lost a job, or maybe you got a bad grade on your exam from Professor Estelle, and the person refused to sympathize with you, they acted indifferent, like it was no big deal, you would not be able to continue associating with that person, right? You'd be offended in some way. Smith puts it, quote, "If you have no fellow feeling with the misfortunes I have met with, we can no longer converse upon these subjects. We become intolerable to one another." But individuals can disagree about objects of taste and continue to associate. We can agree to disagree about these things. They're not so tied to our own personal emotions. Smith's example is systems of philosophy. If we don't agree on our views of philosophy, let's say we don't agree about the role of the sovereign in Hobbes' Leviathan, for example, we can continue to associate in other ways. Our emotions aren't involved to the degree that is required to sympathize with another individual. So Smith explains, quote, "Though your judgments in matter of speculation, though your sentiments in matters of taste are quite opposite to mine, I can easily overlook this opposition, and if I have any degree of temper, I may still find some entertainments in your conversation, even upon those very subjects." So objects of taste can be discussed objectively because they stand apart from what directly affects us. So I might not be able to sympathize with someone who's distant from me, but maybe I could discuss an aesthetic object with that person. And so taste offers a starting point for associating with others. Third, taste is not subject to spatiotemporal limitations. So judging an object of beauty does not require being able to imaginatively enter into the context of another in the same way that sympathy does. Taste depends, actually, on not being personally involved or expecting an exact copy of reality in order for it to please us. Aesthetic pleasure actually relies on difference from reality. We enjoy figuring out, for example, how a piece of art differs from actual things. Smith tells us, quote, "The eye, even of an unskillful spectator, immediately discerns, in some measure, how it is that a certain modification of figure in statuary and of brighter and darker colors in painting can represent with so much truth and vivacity the actions, passions, and behavior of men, as well as a great variety of other objects. We wonder and are amazed at the effect, and we are pleased ourselves and happy to find that we can comprehend in some measure how the artist achieved that effect," right? End quote. So sympathy, on the other hand, brings us happiness and social concord when it achieves a correspondence of emotions, right? The goal is to have mutual sympathy. When we tell someone that we've been pained in some way, we want them to try to understand as best they can. We don't want distance, right? We want someone to feel with us. But if art perfectly approximated reality, we wouldn't enjoy it. But sympathy, though never perfect, seeks as great a concord of emotions as possible. So in this way, appreciating beauty does not rely on context in the same way as sympathy. It is why the beauty of nature can be appreciated no matter what culture you live in, for example. Fourth, and this one's really important for Smith, taste can be educated and changed more easily than sympathy and moral judgment. Taste is mutable. It's subject to the influence of custom and fashion, which often shift and change. This is why somehow the fanny packs and jogging suits of my childhood are back in style. But this is its virtue compared to sympathy. We can change it. Moral judgment cannot and should not be so easily changed because standards of justice for Smith, quote, "require exactness." But taste can be educated. Smith provides an example of what this education might look like for his readers. He compares the European practice of wearing corsets to other cultures' practices of trying to achieve beauty. And in one example, he mentions Chinese foot binding. And Smith says the following: "Europeans are astonished at the absurd barbarity of this practice, to which some missionaries have imputed the singular stupidity of those nations among whom it prevails. But when they condemn those savages," his language, "they do not reflect that the ladies of Europe had, till within these very few years, been endeavoring for near a century past to squeeze the beautiful roundness of their natural shape into a square form of the same kind, and that, notwithstanding the many distortions and diseases which this practice was known to occasion, custom had rendered it agreeable among some of the most civilized nations which perhaps the world ever beheld," end quote. So Smith is telling us that while Europeans are busy judging other cultures for the ways that they desire to shape their bodies, they don't see the flaws in their own customs of beauty. using corsets to squeeze their form into an unnatural and unhealthy shape, which, though they think is beautiful, causes many health issues. I don't know about you, but I'm not anxious to bring back corsets, right? The implication of Smith's example is that beauty need not be restricted by the particular customs of particular places. We can be taught to see beauty beyond our specific context. That's what Smith's trying to do with his readers. He wants to shock his readers out of their complacency and thinking that their standard of beauty is best simply because it belongs to their particular culture's fashion. He reinforces that because taste is influenced by custom, changing the circumstances or perspective of the spectator can alter our sensibilities. And finally, taste can stimulate sympathy. So in many of the examples I've given, taste offers a mode of connection that might not be available simply through sympathy. Shared experience of cultural objects provides a context for which to sympathize with others. And in this way, taste helps explain one way the market could help solve the spatiotemporal problem that exists with sympathy. It highlights the importance of discerning degrees from perfection rather than perfection itself. He gives the example of judging the beauty of a work of art. If we are always examining a painting by standards of perfection, we'll always judge it as flawed, because human beings can never produce exactly what we see in nature. And he thinks that moral judgment and sympathy need to learn this lesson from aesthetic judgment. Human beings also are never perfect, and we have to assign propriety to their behavior and character by comparison, by determining better and worse, rather than saying that someone is perfect or flawed. Taste can also stimulate sympathy by honing our judgment, which can then strengthen our moral judgment and our ability to control our behavior, what Smith calls self-command. Taste also teaches how to judge the beauty of the character of others. So if we compare taste and sympathy, we see that taste can provide emotional connections that sympathy cannot, because it's not limited by space, time, and culture. Sympathy requires particular interactions, but taste can rely on objective thinking. Taste requires an emotional reaction to an object, while sympathy requires actually putting ourselves in another's shoes. Sympathy seeks mutual sympathy, or the highest degree of correspondence possible, while taste requires distance from reality, or a lack of perfect correspondence. And finally, because of sympathy's role in fostering moral judgment, it cannot be easily changed. But taste is based partly on custom and fashion and can be altered and educated. We'll see with Smith, there's always sort of here's an upside and here's a downside. So there's some limits to what taste can do. Smith describes good taste in part to caution against corrupt taste, which actually denies human freedom. So for him, love of beauty becomes corrupt when we start pursuing that pleasing order just for its own sake, and thereby seek a kind of perfection that's not possible in human life or political economy. So Smith's famous invisible hand metaphor that you might have heard of appeals to his readers because it suggests that perfection or design is possible. We can achieve it in human affairs. And while we're going to get some order from our efforts, as many like Friedrich Hayek have shown, both in nature and human society, this order is never going to reach perfection. So recall Smith's example about judging art and judging people, judging the moral behavior of others. Just like art can't perfectly resemble what it's trying to imitate in nature, human beings are never going to behave perfectly. And Smith describes a character to try to explain this problem with seeking perfect order. He calls him the man of system. And so he makes an analogy to a game of chess. And he says this man of system forgets that society is not a game where he can simply move people about like pawns trying to achieve his ends. He says instead he should realize that each piece has its own principle of motion. People have their own goals, right? We might think of many examples in the history of political thought or characters that fit this man of system description. In Smith's example, the man of system is so enamored with the supposed beauty of his plan that he forgets he's administering human beings. And the beauty he seeks isn't true beauty because it wouldn't be possible in reality. He forgets to sympathize with those he is administering, and in doing so, misses an opportunity to coordinate with others while actually depriving them of their freedom and the benefits they could receive from sympathy. And he contrasts this character with another one, the man of public spirit, who actually demonstrates the power of good taste. He also loves beauty, but his love of beauty inspires a kind of patriotism that drives him to sacrifice his own interest for the greater good. He's not motivated by pure sympathy either, but is inspired by his idea about, quote, the great system of government and the wheels of the political machine, end quote. But the man of public spirit understands that the system will only ever be able to approximate perfection. And he sympathizes with those he is administering by moderating his behavior so as to, quote, accommodate as well as he can the public arrangements to the confirmed habits and prejudices of the people. So for the man of public spirit, beauty inspires him to participate in public life and to sympathize with those he is administering. He does not put beauty above sympathy, but for him, taste acts as an impetus to achieving the common good. So for Smith, taste becomes bad, it becomes corrupt when we try to use it to achieve perfect order at the expense of other people. Now I want to turn to two related examples to demonstrate how taste works to extend affection in Smith's political economy, and also how it can work against that. So Smith's treatment of mercantilism and colonization tracks onto his account of how bad taste, where we try to judge beauty as perfect order, can actually substitute for sympathy. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to focus on how Smith's analysis of taste helps us understand his normative critique of political economy, as well as why he thinks trade can and ought to facilitate cosmopolitanism instead of further dividing individuals and fostering violence. So he writes about the European practice of colonization across many countries. He talks about Spain and Portugal, but he focuses extensively on his home country, examining Britain's colonial policies, and in particular, he actually focuses on their treatment of the American colonies. And he publishes his economic text, Wealth of Nations, in 1776, an important year that we recognize, right? But some, like his friend David Hume, suggest that he actually delayed publishing this work because of the War of Independence. Hume tells him, by all accounts, your book has been printed long ago, and yet it has never been so much as advertised. What is the reason? If you wait till the fate of America be decided, you may wait too long. And yet, Smith wades into this territory and actually evaluates Britain's colonization of America. He argues that Britain should actually emancipate the American colonies and seek constitutional union. Clearly, Britain doesn't follow his advice. He gives this advice to the then Prime Minister, Lord North's Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, in a piece he writes called Thoughts on the Contest of the State of the Contest with America. And I'll actually return to his critique in a minute here. But first, Smith's treatment of mercantilism. So for him, mercantilism demonstrates the problem of bad taste, where we pursue order and control rather than free interaction. And in this case, it's interaction in the market. So mercantilists believed that they could bring about economic prosperity by force if they connected power and the pursuit of plenty. So while economic exchange should be, according to Smith, quote, among nations as among individuals, a bond of union and friendship, end quote. Instead, because of mercantilist theory, he said nations have been taught that their interest consisted in beggaring all their neighbors, end quote. So the political economic theory of mercantilism is based on two flawed understandings of economic policy for Smith. One, that wealth consists in gold and silver, and that those metals could be brought into a country which had no mines only by the balance of trade or by exporting to a greater value than it imported. Thomas Munn, the director of the East India Company in the 17th century, calls this overbalance of trade a rule to increase our wealth and treasure. So the mercantilists pursue this system, pursue this kind of order, rather than judging particular instances and engaging with particular people. So Smith explains how the mercantilist system, in seeking wealth through this order that they think they've devised in this great system, enables, quote, statesmen to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals. And instead he advocates that every individual, it is evident, can in his local situation judge much better than any statesman or lawgiver can do for him, end quote. So that is, mercantilist rules dictated where you could buy goods and whom you could sell goods to. So for example, Smith's friend David Hume complains that mercantilism is going to force him to buy crappy English wine instead of good French wine. He doesn't like this so much. Economic interactions ought to be particular rather than systematic in this way. And there are consequences for misjudging value and being captivated by the dazzling and luxurious, for sympathizing with distant others, and for the cosmopolitan ends of commerce to be realized. So indeed, in his analysis of the problem and thinking that wealth consists in gold and silver, and therefore misunderstanding how wealth is generated from trade, Smith points to the ways in which Europeans' flawed judgment prevents them from extending their sympathy to distant others. So as this cartoon illustrates, the economic system allowed the mother country to treat the colonies and the people within them as things they could use for their own wealth gain, for their own benefit. The mercantilist system also causes disaffection between merchants and the very nation that's giving them a monopoly from their trade. There's no incentive for the merchant to invest in the fate of his countrymen because the connection is only insofar as he makes money from the monopoly his company enjoys on behalf of the mother country. There's no occasion for sympathy in this commercial transaction because the system is not based on free exchange. So turning to the broader treatment of colonization, Taste helps us see that Smith's critique is not just economic, but it's also moral. And a focus of his account is the horrors of colonialism and the consequences for sympathy. And he looks at the way Columbus and his crew treated the inhabitants of the New World as objects they could appropriate rather than human beings they could engage with. So just as he critiqued the mercantilist focus on system, Smith focuses on Columbus's wonder, this is the language he uses, at the imagined beauty he could extract from the colonies. So when Columbus and his men did not kill the natives they encountered in the New World, they used them to try and find the gold that he imagined was there, right? So while the natives that they encounter are only wearing little fillets of gold, really small amounts, Columbus remains convinced that he's going to find great stores of it in the mountains. They're only finding small amounts in streams. So Columbus and his explorers do not understand true beauty. They're pursuing this ideal order that they've invented, right, that allows them to ignore the humanity of those whom they propagate atrocities onto in their pursuit of dominion and gold. They're ignoring the facts on the ground, right? So Smith implies that there ought to have been an occasion for sympathy. If these explorers had actually sympathized with those they interacted with, they might not have spent so long seeking gold in vain. They could have pursued free trade instead of plunder. So Smith continues his telling of the tale, noting that when Columbus returns to Europe, he tries to sell the Spanish court on his vision of the colonies providing immense wealth. Smith says, he had only found little fillets of gold and some cotton, but, quote, the rest were mere objects of vulgar wonder and curiosity. Some reeds of an extraordinary size, some birds of a very beautiful plumage, some stuffed skins of the huge alligator and manatee, all of which were preceded by 6 or 7 of the wretched natives whose singular color and appearance added greatly to the novelty of the show, end quote. So Columbus and the others on the voyages to the New World did not view the people there as people to sympathize with, as the quote illustrates, but as radically different others, as unique as all the objects, such as plant and animal life, that they had never seen before. And so he presents them to the court as mere novelties at which to wonder. Columbus treats the colonies as objects that played a role in his larger vision of gaining wealth and his ideas of perfection and order. And this was common in the time of colonization. Aesthetic categories were often employed to scientifically justify racism and dehumanization. So in the most famous 18th century example, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach created a typology of skulls, arranging them from least to most beautiful. And the colonizers actually do something similar in Smith's account. They admire the natives as beautiful objects that they can use and abuse. So beyond the violence that the colonizers engaged in, Taste shows why Columbus's pursuit of wealth furthers the problem of sympathetic distance and prevents the freedom the economic exchange could bring to both the Europeans and the natives. So turning from the native population to the European emigrants, Smith argues that defending the American colonies is actually really expensive. So this is one of the reasons he gives why Britain should give up the colonies and allow them to be citizens of Britain. However, Smith argues that Britain won't do this, despite the actual economic benefits, because Britain enjoys, in part, the order and perfection it thinks it gets from possessing the colonies. So the system of mercantilism that captivates the politicians is not as ordered as they imagine, according to Smith. So while he certainly argues that Britain is benefiting from monopoly trade, Smith argues that they could have even greater gains if they open trade. Second, he argues that mercantilism benefits the parties who are colluding with the government more than the general population. And third, it limits the division of labor because it limits the extent of the market. He argues that an additional reason Britain won't give up the colonies is an emotional attachment to the idea of system and how Britain thinks they bring them power and wealth. Smith puts it, "The monopoly of the great commerce of America naturally seems to be an acquisition of the highest value. To the undiscerning eye of giddy ambition, it naturally presents itself amidst the confused scramble of politics and war," and this is the key part, "as a very dazzling object to fight for. The dazzling splendor of the object, however, the immense greatness of the commerce, is the very quality which renders the monopoly of it hurtful." So like Columbus, Britain behaves like an economic man who is focused on gaining wealth and captivated by the beauty of his plan to do so. And he does not take into account the normative consequences of his policies. He's like the man of system, right? Proper aesthetic judgment would require seeing that the colonies can never be perfectly ordered according to a political plan, and then would demonstrate the disorder that comes from economic manipulation. This is not to say for Smith that if the colonizers had proper aesthetic judgment, they could colonize more efficiently or something like this. Proper aesthetic judgment requires seeing the evils of colonization and engaging in free trade instead, which offers opportunities to profitably work with distant others. So corrupt taste removes the possibility of sympathy. Now I want to turn to a way in which free trade could work. Right? In one example, Smith demonstrates how taste can be expanded in the colonial market and how free trade can foster and expand the possibilities and potentiality of sympathy. So we talked about how the market can be one solution to the problem of extending sympathy to distant others. The market can also offer an outlet for taste to spread. And so he doesn't talk about taste a bunch in the discussion of the colonies explicitly. He's often talking about the cultural practices of the inhabitants and the goods the colonizers think they can extract from the mother country, as we talked about. But he does discuss it in one particular instance early on in Book 4 of Wealth of Nations. And he presents an example of a colonial product from the Portuguese island of Madeira that influences European practices, Madeira wine. And he explains how Madeira wine was able to slip past the British monopoly on wine exports because its trade was not restricted. The free trade of this good made it very, very popular in the Americas and West Indies. So Smith shows, I think, two things in this example. First, an economic lesson that we might expect him to give us, that free trade moves goods better than trade limited by monopoly. But he also demonstrates the power of a foreign good to change the fashion through exchange. Madeira wine opened the door for sympathetic relationships between foreign nations, foregoing the monopoly rules on trade, because they now shared a common interest, a taste for this particular wine. So Smith argues that the development of the colonies should have beneficial consequences. The market should allow individuals to trade goods and in doing so connect distant parts of the world through their cultures and experiences. And in the case of the Madeira wine, taste can provide a link between individuals and overcome the problem of distance. But corrupt taste, like that of Columbus and the mercantilists, seeks a rational, perfect system of, quote, splendor and glory, which is not achievable in human life. So the system they seek seems perfect and beautiful to those who have designed it, but because the colonizers treat colonization not as an opportunity for sympathetic exchange, but as an opportunity for, quote, plundering of the defenseless natives, according to Smith, and denying representation to the colonists, they are preventing themselves from experiencing the freedom gained from open trade. More importantly for Smith here, they are denying subjectivity and autonomy to those they are using. So sympathy might require too much of individuals, relating between foreign nations at first. But he thinks at the very least, they could share in an appreciation of the beauty of the resources available to be traded. So there's a lot that taste can do in Smith's theory, but he's pragmatic, and taste is not meant to be a perfect project or the only solution to liberalism's problems. So for him, taste shouldn't actually replace sympathy. We cannot judge other human beings by the same standards we would, in his words, quote, commend a chest of drawers. Instead, Smith suggests that it is in particular instances only that the propriety or impropriety, the merit or demerit of action, is very obvious and discernible. So the distance required to make an aesthetic judgment can be beneficial because it allows us to connect with a distant other, but it cannot replace the connection that is possible through fellow feeling. So taste best serves a liberal society when it acts as an impetus to sympathy. So I've argued that liberal political economy needs taste. It can supplement market relations and it can help bolster civil society. It can allow individuals to connect when the requirements of sympathy are hard. Taste can also help individuals get past excessive individualism. It requires being drawn out of oneself by the emotions that beauty arouses and offers an opportunity to connect with another person based on that shared experience of beauty. Taste can provide a parallel to moral judgment, helping to foster our individual judgment and discernment of better than worse. And it's kind of an easier starting point than moral judgment or emotional connection, which requires us to check our self-love first. Corrupt taste, however, aggravates distance and individualism. So when Smith looks at the dangers of bad taste, this helps us understand why certain utilizations of the market circumvent sympathetic possibilities. His inquiry into colonialism and mercantilism lends itself to arguments against marketization and commodification that impose market structures rather than engaging with local practices and meanings. Smith's aesthetic critique of markets, joined to its power in mercantilism and colonialism, actually supports Karl Marx's later critique of the alienation caused by capitalism. Similarly, his analysis of taste demonstrates that cultural engagement is necessary and morally constructive, while cultural appropriation can be exploitative. So when we deny others sympathy by objectifying them, we limit their freedom by harming their ability to develop self-command and autonomy, and our own freedom by reducing our sympathetic interaction with others. Without sympathy, we lose the opportunity to develop self-command and preclude the opportunity for social coordination. And both outcomes for him lead to a loss of freedom and prevent cosmopolitan possibilities. So taste can help us engage with others in a way that's detached from particular emotions and experiences by providing a shared object to connect over. It forces us to think outside of our particular worldview and base material interests to consider the beautiful outside of ourselves. And taste is necessary for liberalism to avoid a focus on just wealth acquisition or autonomy at the expense of building community with others. And taste encourages the affective dimension of liberalism by checking individualism and self-interest and offering an avenue for meaningful connections. So some key takeaways for liberalism. It shows us why the market and a defense of rights also needs a moral basis to function well and promote freedom. Because liberalism relies on individual judgment and choice and how people work together in civil society outside government, taste is a necessary component to help individuals develop these skills. And finally, taste highlights that liberalism is not about simply satisfying self-interest or being autonomous at all costs, like the critics say. Freedom is also about recognizing the humanity in others and the beauty in the world around us. Thank you.
I want to remind our audience that you can still be submitting questions on slido.com with the code word self-interest. As promised, we'll start with a student question. Do you imagine there to be conflict between taste and moral judgment? For instance, what if fashion conflicts with modesty?
Yeah, I think there can be instances of this, right? So in the example that Smith himself gives, right, some of the fashions lead Europeans to be excessively judgmental of other people, right? So it isn't that Smith just sort of wants our aesthetic judgments to, how should we say, change with the wind and go with whatever particular fashion is happening. For him, that just shows that we can change it. Because fashions change so quickly, we can actually have the ability to alter our aesthetic judgments. But importantly, aesthetic judgment needs to be sort of contemplated, thought about over time, sort of not just a whim that we have. And so I think we would need to think about particular particular fashions, and if we prefer that particular fashion, what are the reactions of the relevant spectators around us too, right? It's not our own judgment all by itself in isolation. Good question.
Great. Our next question is from a Hope College and M&M alum, Cameron. She asks, how can we reorder our tastes to defend liberalism today when it seems as though rational, logical responses, not emotional responses, seem scarce?
Yeah, I think that this is a really, really big issue. And one of the things I was encouraged by thinking about a lot of the conflicts over race, for example, that happened this summer, one of the responses to that was, how is it that we can have a more productive conversation? How can we enter into the situation of other people? And a lot of things that were going around on social media is, you know what we should do? We should read works by Black authors, for example. We should read literature that we're not familiar with and try to respond that way by learning as opposed to just reacting, right? And I think that that's one of the important components. I also have a slide up here with some contemporary examples that I've thought about. Now, these are not perfect because the reason that we know about them is because they're elite examples. But in the first, when Barack Obama was president in 2009, there was this conflict. A white Cambridge, Massachusetts police sergeant arrested a Black Harvard University professor for entering his own home, and a heated controversy ensued surrounding the officer James Crowley and the professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. about whether or not the incident was an example of racial profiling. And so what happened is President Obama invited both Crowley and Gates to the White House to discuss the incident over some beers. There's a lot of alcohol examples in my talk. Though it's debated whether or not this so-called beer summit was successful, the point is that in an emotionally charged incident, lacking reason as the question pointed out, the solution for gathering these polarized parties about the difficult issue of racism was to appeal to shared sentiments about an otherwise neutral subject, beer, right? And what's fascinating is in an interview about this with the New York Times, Gates said that he and Crowley talked as they were getting ready for the official beer drinking to begin. And he says, I said to him, can I have a word with you? And he and I went off and did the beer summit ourselves. And I said, look, I don't know about you, man, but I just want this to go away. And he responded, this is a nightmare. I said to him, the president has come under attack. Racism's coming out of the floor. I'm sure you're a decent person. I forgive you. Let's move on. He goes, that would be the best thing that could happen. And I said, maybe we could find a way to lecture about it. And he laughed and said, anything I can do to get off the beat. And what Gates says he reflects on is that I realized he was funny, and I didn't get that racist vibe from him. Now, not all parties drank the same kind of beer. So reportedly, Obama drank a Bud Light, Biden had a Buckler, Gates drank Sam Adams Light, and Crowley a Blue Moon. But they were able to come together on this basis of, let's have a beer, as opposed to let's fight about this big thing. And then the other example that happened more recently, in 2019, you guys might remember this, Ellen DeGeneres sparked a bunch of controversy. She and former President George W. Bush shared box seats at the October 6, 2019 Cowboys game, and Ellen got a lot of backlash from her fans. And here's how she responded. She said, here's the thing, I'm friends with George Bush. In fact, I'm friends with a lot of people who don't share the same beliefs I have. We're all different, and I think we've forgotten that that's okay, that we're all different. And so in between joking, she emphasized that it's possible to be friends with people who think differently. She was, of course, criticized because she's sharing an interest with someone who's anti-gay marriage. And she says, when I say be kind to one another, I don't mean only the people who think the same way you do. I mean be kind to everyone. And so I think her comments highlight the role of shared judgment, experience, and emotion over a non-political subject. Again, these are not perfect corollaries, but they give us some examples to think about ways in which when we take away, when we take away the emotion and we get outside, then we're actually able to have a rational discussion, right? Because we've moved it outside the locus of the thing that's so deeply upsetting us. Thanks.
Thank you. Another student question. Is taste being educated simply the trends of society, or are we actually changing our tastes?
Yeah, you could say, well, Smith, it just kind of seems like it's relativism. So we just go with whatever everybody thinks, right? But I think that's why it's important to him, and for all my thinkers really, that it's not just whatever you think and feel in the moment. In my chapter on Hume, Hume's the big party guy, he's talking about how we form taste over wine. He's like, look, no one's going to believe you that you say a wine's good if you're trying it for the first time. That doesn't work, right? You have to sort of build your judgment over time. And you also have to discuss it with other people. So if you think it's good, but you can't defend and give reasons to other people, then your judgment's sort of meaningless, right? It's not just about you, but it's about the discussion you're having with other people. So in that way, I'd say it's not just sort of whatever the tide says, right? We have to sort of discern over time and with others.
Taking into account the pros and cons of human sympathetic side, do you think our ability to sympathize is beneficial or harmful overall?
Say the beginning part of that again for me? Yeah.
Taking into account the pros and cons of human sympathetic side.
Yeah. Beneficial overall. I mean, for Smith, for sure, beneficial. For him, he thinks, like, how else would we even begin to understand people if we didn't try to put ourselves in other people's shoes? I mean, he thinks we do that inevitably. Think about my joke example. You don't sort of consciously think now, is that person responding properly? Right? You just have a reaction. We're doing it all the time. So I think on the whole, he thinks it's beneficial, but we definitely have to worry about the ways in which it can sort of confine us to our own geographic space or our own circle of friends, right? And so we need it plus some stuff.
Great. If taste is just as vulnerable to corruption and misdirection as self-interest, how can it possibly serve as a check and or balance for self-interest?
Yeah, I think that's a great one, right? So you could look at my examples of mercantilism. I just like this cartoon, so I want to go back to it. Yeah, it's not mine. I wish I was that talented. But yes, you could just say, like, taste seems not really strong enough to combat these problems, right? Because they existed anyway. Smith has this whole theory of taste, and we have all of these negative examples of colonialism and mercantilism, and we have this one example of that Portuguese wine, changing the example. And I think there's something to that, but I think part of what Smith's after, taste has these positive components, but also understanding it can help us see why we might tend towards our self-interest in all these negative ways that we might not otherwise recognize. So certainly you could say about the mercantilist and colonialist examples that, well, they just wanted lots of power, or they just wanted lots of stuff. Like, I don't think taste is a huge component there. But Smith's language is riddled with wonder and the dazzling and the splendor, and I think he's using that language for a reason to help us see the ways in which judgment and aesthetic judgment can limit us in particular ways so that we don't get so out of control. And so I think education is a big component. It's not just going to happen all by itself. And so many of the thinkers in the book focus on different ways in which education can happen. For Smith, he's really focused on the ways in which the division of labor, that the Industrial Revolution we see happening a lot through that, needs to be supplemented with education for people so that they can have opportunities to develop their judgment. But critique well taken. Self-interest is very, very powerful.
If taste requires education and refinement, how do you avoid taste becoming a tool of elitism and exclusion?
Yeah, so there's a really prominent thinker, Pierre Bourdieu. That's what he says. He says, look, taste is just a tool that the elite use to try to control people and tell them exactly what they should think or not think. And so we're just being guided by what the elites think some more. In my Rousseau chapter, I really engage with this. And I think one of the ways to try to limit that idea is sort of what can be considered good taste. And so some thinkers more than others put taste in these categories that seem to be the realm of the elite. But Rousseau, for example, says, but you can develop taste over just about anything. So one of the examples he uses is people making their own furniture, right? And he says the sort of woodworker who's in a shop and makes a beautiful chair learns a lot about beauty, doing it, the do-it-yourself movement guy, that's kind of Rousseau, right? That doesn't necessarily need to be the realm of the elite, right? It can be sort of everyday objects, and he really emphasizes that. And so I think on the one hand, it could be this elitist endeavor, but many of the thinkers I'm engaging with are really concerned in which everyday people are finding beauty in everyday things. Tocqueville is sort of another one. He is upset about the ways in which Americans don't behave like aristocrats. He says, American lawyers do this thing where they pick their teeth while they're making an argument in front of a judge, and they spit their chewing tobacco, and they're kind of gross. Like, why aren't they behaving with these manners that I think they should? And yet he sees in ways in which they're developing notions of beauty even in what to him doesn't make sense in this democratic context. And so part of the reason I chose these thinkers was the way in which they're focusing on how this can happen in everyday contexts.
How do we make sure that we don't swing to extremes, one of those extremes being corruptly pursuing beauty and the other being complacent by compromising?
Yeah. This finding of a moderation, I think that's what the question's sort of getting at. I mean, I think, again, not to repeat too much, but I think that that's why it can't just be solely individual. So if it's just whatever my preference is in the moment, it gets really easy to convince myself of an order that I've devised, right? I sort of need to have discussion with others to be able to check that. So I think that's how we achieve some of that moderation.
Another question comes in general, Hope being a Christian college, an interest in self-interest rather than the interest of others. Can you speak to Adam Smith on that topic? I'm sure you can. Would you, please? Speak to Adam Smith on that topic. Should we be more concerned with the interest of others than our own self-interest?
Yeah, Smith thinks it would be great if we were. So he tells this story, and I alluded to it a little bit in the talk, but he says, suppose that somebody injures their pinky finger, they cut it off. And that's naturally going to hurt. You're going to be kind of obsessed with your plight that you've lost a finger. I mean, I think any of us would be upset about that, right? But Smith compares that to that same day, a tsunami has happened across the world and killed 10,000 of his fellows. And he says, really, the person who hurt his little finger should be much more concerned about all these people across the world that died. But guess what? We're involved in our own context. It's really hard to think more about that when we're in a lot of pain and thinking about, hey, we lost our finger. And in fact, we probably should morally be willing to give up our finger to save all of those lives. But that's kind of tough, Smith says. We're not sort of inclined to do that. I had brought up this circles of sympathy. It's going to take me a minute to get back to that. But while I click through there, yeah, we're obviously going to be concerned with the center of the bullseye rather than the outside. So ideally, morally, he would like us to, and he talks about ways that we can try to develop that impartial spectator, that perfect conscience that will lead us to actually prefer other people to ourselves. But that requires a lot of moral training and education. And Smith, being the good economist, I think he kind of has a division of labor morally too. He says, that's really hard, and maybe everyone isn't going to get to that degree of moral advancement. But we can also have people who advance in degrees along the way and have different specialties and skills in that. And he also builds in checks for those of us who aren't so good at that. And I think the market is a really big one that directly plays on our interest in stuff, but then forces us to give a crap about other people.
So I'm going to take questioner's prerogative and try to combine two questions. What should we make the basis of our affective judgment? And if taste is an affective judgment of the beautiful, and God is the most beautiful object to a Christian, might this really limit the fruits of pluralism?
Yeah, I think it really could, right? So what do we make the basis of our affective judgment? I think for Smith, it's both emotion and experience. So I think there are lots of ways we can experience God in the world, right? But we can also experience that emotional, transcendent experience, and that can be the basis that really pulls us outside of ourselves, right? And the more you experience those kinds of things, the better you get at recognizing them, I think. So also important for Smith and for lots of the thinkers in the book, it's an iterative process. You get better at it over time. You get better at recognizing the beautiful or the transcendent. These are great questions, you guys. 8 o'clock at night, and you're still on a Monday.
Really good.
Great questions.
Really good. Well, let's make this the last one, perhaps. When you gave examples of beauty, you gave a lot of physical examples. So we're at a liberal arts college. There's beauty all around us in all our disciplines, perhaps. How can we turn our taste towards the invisible beauty, say math, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think, I give the physical examples. They're sort of easier to latch onto than the philosophical examples. But I think the philosophical systems are equally important for Smith. And in fact, that's where a lot of the dangers can come in, because we can become so obsessed with that in our own minds. But he writes a whole tract about this, and he says the wonder at trying to order the world. I think math is one way we do that. Science is another. Economics is another. Political theory is another, right? We can become very captivated, obsessed even, with trying to figure out those things so that we understand the world better. Our minds are at peace when we feel like we can impose order. So I think the physical things are very important, but also those more abstract things for Smith, equally captivating for him.
Thank you very much. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Wolf, please?
Thank you.
Have a good evening.